talk about an issue that has to do with workplace safety. A lot of times when we gather, it's just common sense issues that help in a comprehensive safety program to prevent injuries. In some cases we deal with issues that are grounded in a regulation or a standard, and that's the case today. A lot of regulations that are enforced by the state agency that's responsible for workplace health and safety, which is MIOSHA, deal specifically with machine and equipment safety, and this is one of them. It has to do with safety procedures that are in place when equipment is not operating, actually when it's being serviced or maintenanced. And it's called, the MIOSHA standard is called the Control of Hazardous Energy Sources. It's referred to as the Lockout, Tagout standard. Because that's what happens, is that there are steps taken to physically lock out and prevent an energy source from getting to a piece of equipment so that it doesn't accidentally start up or energize and injure a person unintentionally. When these procedures are not followed to the letter, when they're ignored, or even when shortcuts are taken, is when people can get hurt pretty seriously. Quite often, if there's a workplace accident that's severe enough to make the newsreels or the headlines, it's as a result of failure to follow lockout procedures. So most of these are pretty straightforward in nature, but very important to pay attention to. This is kind of an awareness session for lockout issues because the detail really only affects a handful of folks within the organization, those who are responsible for performing the service or maintenance on the equipment that's out in the manufacturing area here. But understanding why those steps are taken is real important to everybody who's affected by that process, and that's everybody who works here. So we're going to talk a little bit about the situations when lockout procedures are required, some of the different sources for hazardous energy that we need to control. Electricity is the one that we think of most frequently, and it's really the one that comes into play most often. Most equipment is powered, at least to some degree, by electricity, sometimes solely, sometimes in addition to another power source. But there are several to consider, and we'll talk about what those are today. And then we'll give you a basic outline of how a lockout procedure works. Some of the situations, as I mentioned, when they're performed and why they're done. And if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to ask them. When should you lock out? It's basically necessary when a piece of equipment is being serviced or maintenance is being performed, and anyone either involved in that process or who's working in the vicinity could be injured by the unexpected startup of that equipment, or if there's any kind of energy that's been stored in the system of operating that piece of equipment that could be released while that service is being performed. So to prevent unexpected startup and the release of stored energy, and both of those are very important to consider through the process. So some examples of a maintenance or service operation when a lockout procedure would definitely need to be performed would be if there is a guard that's been removed from that piece of equipment. Another MIOSHA regulation that has to do with equipment safety is if a machine has moving parts on it that can hurt somebody while it's running, and an operator, as part of the process of running that equipment, would come close into contact with that, there needs to be an additional mechanism known as a machine safeguard, referred to in short as a guard. If there's a guard on a piece of equipment and you've got to take it off to make an adjustment or fix it, it's got to be locked out, because that by definition would put the operator at risk of being hurt by those or injured by those moving parts. So if a guard comes off, to adjust or repair, the machine needs to be locked out. And in fact, anytime anyone working in the vicinity of that machine would put any part of their body in a position where it could be injured by moving parts on equipment, that's when we got to lock out. Okay, pretty straightforward. If there's stuff that moves that can cut, crush, pinch, or otherwise hurt somebody who's working on it, that's when we need to perform the lockout procedures. And those are the kinds of injuries that can occur, and more often than not can be very serious. It can be a cut, up to including severing a limb. A crushing injury, particularly with larger equipment, and there's even some of that operating out here. I'm thinking particularly of the balers and compactors. Entanglement, if proper care isn't taken to contain loose clothing or hair, it could get caught in moving parts if a machine were to accidentally actuate or energize. striking, pushing. There are a variety of different types of injuries, and they can add up to being very serious. The statistics that are kept, both by the state workplace safety agency, which is MIOSHA, and the federal agency, which is referred to just as OSHA, indicate that about 1 out of every 10 accidents that's classified as serious, 10%, are a result of failure to follow lockout procedures. And that results pretty consistently in tens of thousands of lost work days every year, and unfortunately consistently a number of fatalities as well. In excess of 100. The last year that records were kept, it was 120 deaths as a result of failure to follow lockout procedures. Here in the state, those are national statistics. Here in the state of Michigan, they keep records as well when MIOSHA writes citations, writes a ticket to a company for failure to follow one of their regulations or standards. And lockout procedures is consistently in the top 5, the most frequently cited. Last year records were kept, it was number 2 for most often cited, but it is almost always number 1 for the severity of the penalties that are levied, which are fines, monetary fines, the amount of dollars that companies have had to pay because they didn't follow lockout procedures properly, and that was detected by MIOSHA. Tops the list for the penalties that they write. So they take it very seriously, as well they should, because failure to follow those procedures can result in some pretty serious injury. There's some definitions from the rule that y'all should be familiar with, and it has to do with how you interact with this regulation. The first term is called an authorized employee, and those are the folks who are doing the work, doing the service or maintenance, and therefore need to be familiar with, in detail, the lockout procedures on a step-by-step basis. If you're a machine operator or working in the vicinity, referred to as an affected employee under this rule. And there's another classification under the regulation that I don't pay much attention to because I think everybody else is an affected employee. If you are at any risk at all of getting into harm's way when a piece of equipment is being serviced or maintenance, then you're affected by that process, and therefore that's the category that you fall into under this regulation. Authorized employees need to become familiar with how a lockout procedure works in detail. Affected employees need to be familiar with it in principle, in general, which is what we'll focus on today. The other important term is something called an energy isolating device. That's what keeps the power from getting to the equipment that might cause the problem in the first place. It's something that physically prevents the energy from activating the equipment or from being released during the process. And an example of that would be, for electricity in particular, would be a disconnect switch or a circuit breaker. The switch, the on-off switch on the piece of equipment is not an energy isolating device. It simply tells the machine to stop and go. It doesn't prevent the power source from reaching the equipment. You need to take a step back in the process, if you will, to do that. And with electricity, we find that either at a disconnect or a circuit breaker. If there's another type of energy involved, like pneumatic pressure, there's air pressure that powers or actuates the equipment, or maybe hydraulic pressure, if there's fluid in a line, the pressure from which helps make that equipment run, and there's a couple of examples of each out here, then there would be a valve, a line valve, which could be any number, a handle that needs to be turned, or perhaps a flywheel that opens or closes those lines to keep the power from getting there. Again, a push button, any kind of a selector switch, or an on-off switch like a light switch, just tells the machine to stop and go. It doesn't keep the power from getting to the equipment, so just turning something off will never effectively lock out the machine or prevent the energy source from getting to the equipment and potentially harming the person who's doing the service or maintenance. So the sources of energy to be considered when we're going to write up and conduct a lockout procedure. The main one is electricity. There are two other kind of force or pressure sources of energy that I mentioned already, pneumatics and hydraulics. But anytime there's fluid or gas in a line, those need to be considered, as well as mechanical energy. If something is spring-loaded or a flywheel is attached to a cable or line that helps to activate it, even if it's just a cycle back and forth, that needs to be considered. And right down to gravitational energy, because what goes up must come down. And equipment out here, like the balers, for example, is a prime example of instances when sometimes that force is ignored. We can do remove the electrical power source and isolate it, disconnect all the hydraulic lines that help that big powerful ram to go up and down and bail the cardboard or the clothing. But if the ram is in the up position when the work needs to be performed, eventually that can come down, that can drop, it can do serious damage. So blocking or placing some other type of device in there to keep whatever it is, especially on presses and balers, from coming down is really important to consider. So there's a variety of sources to consider, and that's one of the main processes that we go through when we need to write up a lockout procedure, is all the various sources of hazardous energy. So here's what we do when a procedure needs to be followed. The first is, and this would affect the authorized employee who's doing the lockout procedure. First of all, is to notify all affected employees. That's anybody who could be at any risk at all of getting in harm's way when the service or maintenance is being performed. Let them know that it's happening, and basically to get another assignment, to stay out of harm's way. The next is to review the written lockout procedure. And it's fine to understand the concept of what's involved in a lockout, which is what hopefully we'll all walk away with this afternoon. But each piece of equipment has to have a specific written procedure, because the lockout steps that you would take for the baler out here would be different from a grinder or a saw or a different type of equipment. So each one has a specific written procedure, and that's required under the standard. The next is to identify all energy sources. And there's a template or a chart that MIOSHA provides to employers that they can use to walk through that process and say, is there electricity involved in this? If so, where and how do I isolate it? Are there pneumatics involved? If so, where are they located and how do I isolate them? Step-by-step procedure to review all the energy sources. And then the next is to physically shut it down, turn it off, and that's when we do use that on-off switch or push-button selector. Then go back to disconnect that power source and isolate the energy, which means if it is electrical, we go back to the disconnect or to the circuit breaker, turn that off, and then physically lock it out, which means apply a padlock to which only one person, the individual who's performing that procedure, has the key to make sure that nobody can come back and accidentally turn the power back on. And that quite often is how accidents happen when shortcuts are taken. If an individual who's performing maintenance turns off the machine, quick flicks the disconnect, and thinks they'll only be at it a few minutes, and the padlock isn't on them, maybe it's back in the maintenance crib, and they go ahead and get involved, and then the next person who comes along who may have been inconvenienced by shutting down that machine flicks that disconnect switch, and that's when bad accidents can happen. So to physically lock it out with a padlock. The term tagout is used in the standard. It's really just an add-on to an effective procedure. A tag is applied that says do not use, or lockout procedures being performed, some type of a sign so that all affected employees can identify what's going on. And then once the power source, the energy source, has been isolated, we also need to consider stored energy. And that's especially true with air pressure and with hydraulic pressure. Because if a machine has multiple power sources, just because the electricity's been turned off, and even if it's been isolated, it doesn't mean that it can't actuate if it's also under air or fluid pressure. So at times that might mean finding the hydraulic line, turning off the valve, and then it also might mean disconnecting the line and draining whatever fluid or air pressure is in the system as an added step to make sure that equipment doesn't cycle or actuate. Yeah. And the next, before anybody gets involved in performing the service or maintenance, is to test the equipment. To go back and go ahead and push that on and off switch and make sure that it doesn't run and that in fact it can't. So notifying all the affected employees, take a look at the written lockout procedure, make sure all the energy sources have been identified, then physically shut it down, locate the power source and disconnect it and turn it off, apply that lockout device, which is the padlock. Go ahead and tag it out as well, which is just to add a small sign or indicator what's going on here. And then physically test it before you get involved in performing that service. Now once we're done, if the machine's been adjusted or repaired, the first thing to do is make sure that it is in proper operating condition and that if a guard's been removed, if that's the reason we had to perform the lockout procedure, it definitely has to be put back on before it's cycled, even before it's tested to make sure that it's back in adjustment, because it's just too easy for someone to get into a dangerous position, into harm's way, if that guard hasn't been replaced. If there's tubing or hoses that have been removed to neutralize any stored energy, certainly those get reattached and repositioned, making sure that the work area is clear, any tools that have been involved in the process have been safely removed, and that once we notify the affected employees that it's safe to re-enter the area as they do that, making sure that if any personal protective equipment was involved in doing that job, that it was put back on and was doing what it's supposed to do, to make sure that tags and locks are removed by those authorized employees and only by those authorized employees. After something's been serviced or maintained, the guards have to be put back on before the machine starts up again. The one lock, one key rule should be followed absolutely, which means if there are multiple individuals who are authorized to lock out equipment, they should each have their own lock and they should each have just one key. It's acceptable to have an alternate that's kept in a separate space securely by a supervisor, but in terms of the folks who are doing the work, one lock and one key. And if there are multiple players involved in a repair project, then there's something called a daisy chain device or another hasp or a clip that you can attach, to the disconnect switch or to the energy isolating device, so that will accommodate both those padlocks, and that will make sure both individuals, again, have done what they need to do and are out of harm's way before we get started again. And we have to be specific. There has to be a written lockout procedure for every single piece of equipment that requires it. Now, there is a common sense feature inserted into the standard for what's called cord and plug connected equipment. If the only power source for a machine is electricity, and the only way of connecting that is a cord and a plug, like the projector that I had, like the laptop, like a hand tool, a power drill, or a saw. We don't need to write a lockout procedure for that. But we do need to make sure if equipment that falls into that category is ever being serviced or maintenance, the person who's doing it has that plug under what's called their exclusive control, which means they can see it, they can touch it, it's in their pocket, or it's under their foot, but it's not possible for anyone else to gain access to it, to accidentally plug it in and get it started. For something like a drill or a saw, it's straightforward common sense. I think who would ever do that? But there is equipment that's as sizable and dangerous as a plastic granulator or a grinder that's powered only by electricity and sometimes is connected to its power source by cord and plug. And the worst potential accident that I ever saw that was averted came about when somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do with a cord and plug procedure, and that was for plastic granulators, if you're running molding operations, that's color sensitive. When you finish grinding one color, you got to clean out the machine before you introduce another. So this grinder was being cleaned out. It's being serviced because they were going to do a color change. And so the maintenance person pulled the plug and then went around, which was in the back of the grinder, which stands about this wide and this tall. Went around the front, opened the door, and got inside to clean it out. And if you've ever seen the inside of one of those grinders, they got blades about half as long as I am, and can do serious damage not just to plastic, but to anything that comes in their way. And in this particular work cell, the crew had been disciplined the day before for housekeeping procedures, including allowing trip hazards in their area. And here the maintenance guy had pulled the plug on the grinder and left it lie across the aisle. So if the next person who came along thought, that ain't right, the trip hazard in my work cell, I need to fix that, and picked it up and plugged it in, then it could have been a tragic disaster. So just be cautious. Even though if you got a small piece of equipment that's easy to figure out, that makes sense. But even something as potentially dangerous as a plastic granulator might just be cord and plug connected. Make sure that it's under your exclusive control if you got to do the work. Okay, for those of you who are authorized employees, there's a process that's required under the standard called periodic inspection, which means the employer has to make sure that the folks that they're authorizing to do that work are doing it right, which means you might be observed. You might be asked to actually perform a lockout procedure, and somebody would watch you go through those steps to make sure that not only it's being performed correctly, but that the procedure is still written accurately. And if there's any discrepancy between the two, the procedure doesn't apply anymore, or perhaps the maintenance person makes an error in the lockout procedure, then retraining is required. It's part of the process, and that's when we do need to revisit these issues if there's ever a change in job assignment, if a machine or process changes dramatically, or if there's a performance error that's observed either through the course of the workday or if somebody's being observed. So this is a regulation that doesn't apply when equipment's operating, but when it's not. But if we don't pay attention to it, we can really put folks who are being asked to perform that work, and really anyone who's operating equipment in that area, at serious risk. So please take it under consideration. Does anybody have any questions for me on lockout procedures or other safety issues? Yeah?
Is there a way that we can request that on paper? Something we can have to look at?
The lockout procedure? Absolutely. Yep. It's quite often posted by the equipment, and if it's not, it should be in the safety manual. And again, not just a generic description of notify employees, identify energy sources, disconnect, lockout, but a specific. So for the bailiff, for example, this is powered by electricity, and this is where I will find the disconnect switch in the northeast corner of the building, to that level of detail. And yes, that all should be documented, and especially folks who are doing that work should be reviewing that written procedure. But even people who are in the affected category can certainly ask for that. Yep. It ain't no secret.
Do you have to be certified for every machine that you might work on, or just be like certified one time? And
it's not a certification process, but a training process, and the answer is yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yes. Because it can be different, especially if there's multiple power sources. We want to make sure that each piece of equipment gets specific training for the person who's doing that work. Yeah, good question.
What about like troubleshooting? I mean, do you like say you're running a machine and you know what the problem is? Can you remove the guard and just fix it?
And that's the kicker right there. Anytime the guard has to be removed, that's when the machine has to be locked out.
It has to be locked out.
Yep.
All right.
Any others? How are we doing on consecutive days? I didn't see the sign when I came in.
I haven't changed it today, but we're at 20.
Okay.
We did hit a year, and we celebrated that last Thursday.
Awesome. What happened for the year?
What happened to the
Yeah.
year?
No, I mean, what happened for the celebration? You did
We
hit a
had
year?
a big lunch. Fried chicken,
Like huge?
pies.
Huge.
Nice.
We all took naps after lunch.
Well, keep up the good work. Get another streak started. Hope you all have a nice holiday. If you have questions you prefer to ask privately, come up and see me afterwards. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.